Right now, the Yankees are at 40 on their 40-man roster. So in theory, the team is full. We think there's a few possible upgrades, but it is plausible that the Yankees go in with the team that they have right now. But we're going to talk through some of those options, where those upgrades might be. And we gave a bit of a preview. I think first off the jump is the Frankie Montas injury, who was our number 5 starter. And it felt really good for about a month after we signed Rodon, right? Looking at all those graphics, seeing Luis Severino as your 4 and Frankie Montas as your 5, I think was really nice for Yankees fans to share on Twitter and the Instagram stories, to kind of rub in the face of how elite this pitching rotation can be. But the reality is, it seems like Montas is going to be out for at least a month. That's what we're told. Since the trade deadline, he obviously was a little bit hurt, and he didn't perform well when he was healthy. And what came first, chicken or the egg kind of situation. I'm gonna think that Montas was dealing with an injury, which led to some of his ailments. And with pitching, something that's so repeatable that relies on mechanics, just being off a little bit can contribute to that. But now it's looking like we traded for Montas in early August. It's looking like we're not going to have Frankie Montas for about a year after that trade. And what does that value mean? And what does the back end of our rotation look like now? What are your initial thoughts about the Frankie Montas injury?
First of all, I do feel for the dude because like going through shoulder stuff is not fun. You just like you feel restricted in terms of your mobility and your ability to cock your arm back and actually throw. So I wouldn't see it as like a possibility that like I'm sure that he's been injured for a while and he just never seemed like the second that he got to New York City, he was coming from what, a funeral, right? So like there was already that weighing on his mind. It just never seemed like he found his footing in terms of talking to the media. He just looked very uncomfortable from the get-go. And people said, like, oh no, another Sonny Gray situation, especially having that Oakland A's tie. And I mean, you can't write people off for having that feeling at this point. Just because I feel like the Yankees should have done a little more due diligence when it came to this injury. Shoulders are very complex. A lot of different things can be going wrong with them, and it sounds like at best he's got some tendonitis, which is shoulder inflammation. At worst, it could be a ligament injury. So if that's the case, we traded for a pitcher who's not going to be able to do anything for us because he's only there for one more year. Um, and then he's gone, and we traded away let's be real, our best pitching assets for him. Ken Waldichuk is probably going to be at least a 3 or 4,
Ken
if that,
Waldichuk might be their best pitcher,
1 or a 2 at this point.
which is saying more about Oakland than it is about us. But Ken Waldichuk debuting recently in baseball, being a 2 or 3 on an MLB team, like, we can't take away from the fact that Ken Waldichuk is a really high level prospect, and how well JP Sears performed for us throughout the year. Like, he was a prospect that proved it at the major league level in a small sample size, and has continued to be really good for them, for Oakland.
He gave up very few runs from what I remember with the Yankees too. So like this is like they've got their 1 and 2 for Oakland right now, like perfectly set up. And even Luis Medina is a guy that like we forget about all the time, but he was really good as well. So it makes it a lot harder to pull the trigger on a Brian Reynolds trade, for example, when things like that happen. But also at the same time, you can't really get mad at the Yankees for making that trade because what also doesn't happen if that trade is made. You don't trade Jordan Montgomery for Harrison Bader. And I think at this point we all agree that that was a great move to make, because Bader was our main contributor and our sole contributor essentially throughout the playoffs, other than maybe Anthony Rizzo.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate situation across the board. I don't fault the Yankees for making that trade, because I think if you look at the high level potential of Frankie Montas in even last year's postseason, we signed Rodon now, who's going to be our second ace. But if Frankie Montas does what he's proven he's able to do on a pretty consistent level over a large sample the last few years with Oakland, him performing in the playoffs could have changed the tides of where we were at, just dominant. And Sevy and Nestor pitched really, really well in the postseason. So it's ultimately we didn't hit and we got outclassed by Houston. But I think it changes the tenor of the rest of the season if we don't have 5+ outings where Montas gives up 6 to 8 runs within the first 3 innings. I think it changes the momentum of the team. Like, that was a real fall from grace in August where the team had to
Yeah.
rebuild themselves. I think the team could have benefited from cruising maybe to 105 wins, probably still the number 2 seed, but a bit more comfortable. The Judge home run race maybe gets covered up a little bit earlier, even though he was tearing it up while the team was losing. So it's really unfortunate, and I think we can only project. But if the Yankees looked at this injury and they saw it before they traded for Montas, now looking at the opportunity cost of not having Ken Waldichuk and JP Sears, not that we're improving the Oakland A's right now, we're not concerned about them, but losing them as assets, if not as a value to this team, when the Pirates are looking for a massive haul for Brian Reynolds, which is our glaring hole, and we have plenty of infield and outfield prospects that are top level in all MLB circles, but the rumor is that they're looking for pitching. And we might get beat for Brian Reynolds or just not be able to get him because our top 2 pitching prospects went for an injured number 5 that we might not even see until the All-Star break, if at all, this year.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm under the assumption right now that the Pirates haven't been offered a package centered around one of our top prospects yet. And I think the reality is that if we did have those guys from the Montas trade still here, like he would have been Reynolds and Bednar would have been a Yankee by now. I think it's just at that point where like we had so much leverage to make that move, and now we're just kind of sitting and waiting to see if they end up kind of pushing back on their previous like King's ransom ask, which was no one's going to give him what give the Pirates what they want right now. They undervalue Reynolds to the point where they don't see him like in terms of dollar value as a superstar. When in reality, his camp wants, I think it was like 5 years, 120 million or 120, something along those lines. So kind of similar ilk as your Brandon Nimmo's. And if you're trying to compare like a current player that just hit the free agent market, obviously he's got more service time under his belt. And then Reynolds has 3 more years, I think, of arbitration at this point. So that's kind of what you're paying for with prospect capital at this point if you're another team. But it's just a tough situation because I think the Yankees are that's their the prize jewel right now. That's the guy that they would ultimately like to move for because he's the one who rounds out that lineup so well. But at the same time, they're not going to sit around and wait forever. And I do think eventually the dollars or the ask from the Pirates does drop. I think that happens closer to the All-Star break, just because something's got to give. He doesn't want to be there. And I don't think he ultimately fits with their timeline of guys like a Brian Hayes and then also O'Neill Cruz, like those guys really coming into their own. So I think he will be moved at some point, but I don't think the Yankees are just going to just sit on their ass and like do nothing and just roll out Hicks again. That's not viable at this point. And I'm pretty sure that Cashman is feeling the pressure of like heads will roll if Hicks goes out there again to start. So at minimum, I see a move of a Jurickson Profar or someone along those lines to be a stopgap.
Yeah, and we'll get into more of the left field as we have for the last few episodes now. But going to the pitching rotation. So we looked at those graphics, like I was saying before. Frankie Montas, high level number 5 starter, looking at, I think, the deepest rotation or one of the deepest rotations in baseball, and looking at, all right, Domingo Germán, Clark Schmidt, Luis Gil as our 6 through 8 options. That's not too bad. Now, with this one move of Montas being hurt indefinitely, I'm going to say he's back no earlier than May 7th. I think it's going to be more like late June, July.
Yeah, that's closer
Um,
to the All-Star break for sure.
yeah. And with the opportunity for relapse and whatnot, like with what Montas showed injured down the stretch last year, I think the Yankees are going to be ultra conservative with his injury, where they're not going to push him back because, if he's not 100% healthy, I don't think he's worth it. I don't think he's a better pitcher than Domingo Germán, how he performed last year. He's definitely a better pitcher than Domingo Germán, but I'm going to
Talent-wise,
assume
yeah.
talent-wise, yeah. I'm going to assume that he was hurt, and I don't want him throwing innings for us if he's not 100% healthy. Like, I'd rather him just rehab, and if that means he pitches for 6 weeks before the playoffs, like, so be it. But I think we're not going to see him for a long time. He won't be built up. what do you think our rotation looks like now after number 4?
And that's the thing is like you feel really confident with those first four, and then after that, I feel like they really want to give Clark Schmidt the nod just because he is their homegrown guy that they've been high on for a while, and he was one of the few top prospects that's still around to this point. And like you wish you could say that you can see a Davy Garcia coming in, but at this point he's not reliable anymore. He got his shot in 2020 was excellent, and then after that he lost it. And it does sound like he spiked his velo a little bit, but it sounds like if he does come back, he might be more of a relief option. So I just don't think that's viable as well. There are a few guys in the system. I think Johnny Brito is one of the relievers that's in AAA right now, who is supposed to be ready for 2023. So I think him and then Crook are two guys that could potentially make an impact this season, from what I've been hearing about other people that are big on the Yankees prospects. Brito specifically, I think is one internally that could be an option. However, I think that as weird as it to say, like I think that a Michael Wacha might be someone who's not out of the realm of possibility at this point, depending on what his ask is. He was pretty good for the Red Sox last season.
He was pretty good. I don't. I'd be so interested to see if the Yankees go the trade or free agent route. I think
Yeah,
the one thing that's going to keep them from doing it, I think if Montas was confirmed out for 2 to 3 months, they'd be likelier to do it. But if you go internal with some of the guys, I mean, reading off some of the names that are on the 40-man starting
yeah,
pitchers, Randy Vasquez, Yoendrys Gomez, Matt Crook, Devi. Luis Heel, I believe, is not on here because he's still injured,
that'd
but
be yeah.
he's on the 40, as well as Johnny Brito. I
Mm-hmm.
think depending on what the injury looks like, I mean, I'm sure they'll know more, in a month as pitchers and catchers, they'll know more about the talent they have for like the 2, 3 weeks that some of those younger guys are up. And they'll know more about his injury to make those decisions then. That's not a right now decision.
Yeah.
But I think they'd be more likely to stay internal unless they straight up sold on him and went the trade route. I don't think there's anyone on the free agent route. I mean, Walker's a good shout, honestly, but I don't think there's
Walker, yeah.
anyone free agent wise that they think is worth losing that flexibility potentially. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that they don't want to take a hit payroll wise too. So like obviously if you go with the free agent route, you're giving up money. Whereas if you go trade, you're giving up prospects or current players on the team. And there is one guy that we'll get to in a little bit after arbitration, or like the current arbitration situation, that might be now on the trade block depending on how that goes. But I think that there are personally better arms on the trade market, but they would have to get very creative with it. This is one of those times where Cashman could come out of nowhere with like a big random move. Like, let's say he gets someone from the Chicago White Sox. Like there are a few different teams that are fringe that aren't quite playoff teams that could be looking to sell. That we're not really thinking about at this point. But obviously, like if you're thinking about the trade route, Miami is the first team that really kind of hits you, just because they have such a surplus of arms at this point with the Johnny Cueto acquisition. I think they've got four guys essentially that they're shopping around. Obviously, the only one that's not available right now is Alcantara because he's disgusting, and there's no reason to trade him. The second Kim Ang trades him, that's when all hell like boils over.
Sandy
Uh,
for Cole, straight up.
straight up.
Not
You,
even. They wouldn't take the Miami wouldn't take that deal. Cole gets paid too
no.
much money.
Would you take that?
No, no.
Yeah. No. It's a
I
tough
think
one.
that's a lose-lose trade, honestly.
Dude,
I
he
love
pitched
Sandy.
222 innings or whatever last season. That's crazy.
Cole eats that. It's a really underrated aspect of Cole.
Yeah.
Sandy didn't even throw like well, I
This was a
almost said
good
Sandy didn't
season.
throw that much. Sandy threw a lot last year, which was part of his value that they let him rip, but that was the first time, like you said.
Yeah, no,
And
I saw people like talking shit about Cole on Twitter. And it was mainly just I think it was a few like Red Sox fans and then Houston fans comparing like Christian Javier, and I'm like, look at Javier's innings compared to Cole's innings in the last 10 years. Every season, I think he's had maybe 4 or 5 seasons over 200 innings at this point in his career. Like no one does that nowadays. So the amount of value you get from a starting pitcher, like I think it's the easiest way to break it down is like through innings pitched, strikeouts, and then maybe ERA if you want to throw that in there as like the big three. And Cole does all three of those things at an elite level. So anyone that has anything to say about him not being like a true ace for that reason, just like you got to reevaluate what you're looking at. But when it comes to Miami, though, they do have a few guys. Like obviously, we've loved Pablo Lopez, Justin J. Ray, like really does love him as well. And the compelling thing about him is like I was listening to Just Baseball. We talked about this off of the air, but those guys were breaking down how like he's not even the most compelling arm because you know what you're getting out of him. He's the safe option, and he only has a few more years of control. Whereas like guys like Trevor Rogers and then I think it was Edward Cabrera all like have devastating stuff, and they have like I think 4 or 5 years of control left. And it's just like you don't know you've got a lot of upside, but you don't really know what that downside is going to look like because of potential injury, and then also just they're not proven as much. So like there are some really interesting arms that can be thrown in there. And the Yankees do have a surplus of middle infielders, and that's one thing that Miami's kind of been lacking throughout the years. And
So
yeah,
to get into that a bit more, we'll do some housekeeping and then get into the player that you've been teasing.